glass would shatter from the falling stone, leaving me freezing and walking alone. But you built a cage of silver metal wire. You bent the iron over the transparent dome, creating a steady end and brown subway. I watched the orange ember catch and stay. The forest is a hazard of unforgiving wood, but the cage holds firm right where we stood. The wire cage wrapping round the fragile glass. You do not ask the woods to step aside. You give my inner spark a place to hide. I do not have to worry about a shattered shell. You guard the perimeter and you guard it well. The wire cage wrapping round the fragile glass. You do not ask the woods to step aside. You give my inner spark a place to hide. I do not have to worry about a shattered shell. You guard the perimeter and you guard it well. People try to hide the light to keep the glass intact, a cowardly retreat from an undeniable fact. But hiding in the dark deprives the soul of heat, a miserable tactic for a slow defeat. You let the lantern shine and cast a golden glow, illuminating every single path I know. The wire takes the impact and the glass is pure, a physical devotion making me secure. Hold the silver grid, face the winter wind, walk the forest trail where the fears begin. The impact is absorbed and the glass is fine. I trust the simple metal, making safety mine. I realize that loving is an outer ring of steel, a willingness to intercept the damage I might feel. You didn't ask to change the fragile nature of the core. You offered a protection I had never seen before. I hold the heavy handle and I navigate the trees, unbothered by the whistling of the midnight breeze. The light escapes the gaps and paints the frozen ground, the most reliable devotion I have ever found. I set the lantern down upon the cabin floor and know the breaking glass will not occur no more. The wire cage wrapping round the fragile glass. You do not ask the woods to step aside. You give my tired spirit a secure place to hide. The fire burns in safety and the grid is standing strong. I trust your quiet armor where my hopes belong. The glass holds the light, shines, I am safe. A thick sheet of maroon hanging by the glass, a boundary to watch the winter traffic pass. The window leaked a draft across the bedroom floor. I shivered blankets trying to get warm, a victim of the midnight and the rising storm. I used to stare at headlights bleeding through the blind, a chaotic interference for an anxious mind. The sirens and the engines kept my eyes awake. A miserable toll the avenue would take, but you brought a curtain woven dense and deep, a tactile defender for the promises we keep. You pulled the brass rings across the iron rod, a simple intervention from my caring God. The fabric drapes the glass and swallows up the noise, restoring all the fragments of my quiet poise. You do not try to stop the traffic on the street. You insulate the bedroom for a calm retreat. I do not have to flinch at every passing light. You draw the heavy curtain and protect the night. The velvet borders keeping out the bitter freezing glare, a dedicated haven in the winter air. You do not try to stop the traffic on the street. You insulate the bedroom for a calm retreat. I do not have to flinch at every passing light. You draw the heavy curtain and protect the night. People try to sleep with all the windows open wide, with no air for their tired and exhausted souls to hide. But living needs a boundary to separate the day, to wash the overwhelming and the anxious thoughts away. The velvet feels so heavy resting in my tired hand, a barrier I trace and finally understand. The room is pitch black and the temperature is right, a masterpiece of navigating through a messy fight. Pull the fabric shut, block the avenue, leave the noise behind, make the silence true. The cold is trapped outside the perimeter of red. I sink into the mattress and I clear my head. I realize that loving is a very tactile screen, a willingness to modify the spaces in between. You didn't ask to move me to a disconnected town. You took the given room and brought the volume down. I close my eyes and breathe the stillness in the dark, appreciating your reliable and quiet spark. The sirens wail outside, but they are muffled in the weave, a quiet reassurance that my weary lungs believe. I pull the quilt up tight and turn away the door. I do not fear the freezing of the winter anymore. Velvet borders keeping out the bitter freezing glare, safe inside, dedicated haven in the wind, nowhere to hide. Do not try to stop the traffic on the street. You draw the heavy cotton and provide retreat. The noise is just a murmur and the frost is held at bay. I trust your quiet armor as I wait upon the day. The curtain holds, the room is dark, I am resting.
A carousel of memories
sitting on the desk, a plastic projector managing the risk. We pushed the carousel to watch the summer fade. The bulb was a burning in an arrogant heat. I wanted to stare at the picture of your face, to freeze the emotion in a physical place. I left the machine running for an hour or more, a stubborn refusal to walk out the door. But focus light carries an undeniable burn, a damaging lesson I had to learn. The plastic slide melted and the colors turned black, a ruined illusion I am never getting back. The heat dissolves the image in a bubbling dark stain. I watch the smiling photograph erase in silent pain. Scorching the frame, burning up the center of the past, a devastating failure that was never meant to last. I try to hold the moment, but the temperature is high, replacing all the beauty with the suffocating lie. You cannot freeze a history by leaving on the light. I stare at the destruction in the middle of the night. Scorching the frame, burning up the center of the past, a devastating failure that was never meant to last. I try to hold the moment, but the temperature is high, replacing all the beauty with the suffocating lie. You cannot freeze a history by leaving on the light. I stare at the destruction in the middle of the night. Try to skip the carousel to find a better view, to manufacture evidence of me and you. Believe in the bulb burning ruins every single slide, a miserable corner where the empty shadows hide. We stared at the past till the present fell apart, a brutal execution of a solitary heart. The wall is projecting an intimidating gray, a visual translation of the words we couldn't say. Turn the plastic wheel, watch the colors blur, fail to save the face of exactly who we were. The heat is an enemy to fragile little things. I am listening to the sorrow that the burning brings. I realize that clinging to an isolated ghost is a guaranteed destruction of the things you value most. Love requires emotion, it demands to move ahead, not a paralyzed obsession with the bitter words we said. We ruined the foundation by demanding it to freeze and watch the precious narrative succumb to the disease. I pressed the power button and I killed the yellow beam, accepting the finale of a devastated dream. I take the ruined carousel and throw it in the bin. I walk out of the living room and let the air come in. Scorching the frame, burning up the center of the past, a devastating failure that was never meant to last. I try to hold the moment, but the plastic had to burn. I surrendered the illusion and accept the things I learned. You cannot freeze a history by leaving on the light. I turn the dark machine away and step into the night. The bulb is off, the slide is black. I am done. Rubber tube rolling in the summer dirt, a garden connection meant to heal the hurt. We turned the brass spigot to deliver all the rain, a rush of cool water for the dry terrain. The nozzle was pointed at the roots in the earth, expecting a harvest and a vibrant birth. But hiding in the rubber was a jagged, ugly tear, a hidden deterioration breathing in the air. The pressure was lost in the middle of the yard, making the delivery impossible and hard. The water pooled up in the useless muddy grate, a disappointing puddle in the middle of the day. The leaves are turning yellow on the end of the line, a visual ending to your history and mine. The flow is diverted to a meaningless escape. I stare at the ruin of an optimistic shape, dropping the pressure, bleeding in the center of the grass. I try to feed the garden, but the water washes out, leaving me standing in a sea of heavy doubt. You cannot force a future when the conduit is torn. I stare at the destruction and I navigate the morn, dropping the pressure, bleeding in the center of the grass. I try to feed the garden, but the water washes out, leaving me standing in a sea of heavy doubt. You cannot force a future when the conduit is torn. I stare at the destruction and I navigate the morn. I try to wrap a bandage around the weeping rubber skin, to orchestrate a rescue of the era we were in. But water finds a weakness and it pushes through the tape, a cynical maneuver and a cynical escape. We poured our conversation into a broken pipe, ignoring the foundation of the suffocating gripe. The destination suffers while the middle floods the lawn, a terrifying reason not to carry blindly on. Twist the brass valve, watch the water leak, fail to reach the root. The foundation is weak, the current is a casualty of damage we ignored. I am standing in the wreckage of a broken, useless chord. I realize that forcing a connection that is flawed is volunteering entrance for a highly bitter fraud. Love requires a channel that is capable and whole, not a bleeding rubber tearing up the tired soul. We ruin the perimeter by asking it to hold a devastating story that is getting very old. I twist the metal spigot, then I shut the water down, accepting the finale in the center of the town. I drop the empty nozzle in the puddle by my feet. I walk into the avenue and accept the sad defeat, dropping the pressure, beating in the center of the grass. But I dry eyes, trying to stop. I tried to feed the garden, but the water had to spill. I surrender the illusion of a fabricated will. You cannot force a future when the conduit is torn. I turn my collar upward and I leave the empty morn. Dry, the mud is cold, I am leaving. A cube of black silicone resting on the wooden board I used to leave ignored. I watched the charging cable slip right off the edge, fall into the shadows underneath the dusty ledge. I had to crawl around and pull the nylon from the floor, a frustrating habit walking through the bedroom door. My days were a collection of losing my own grip, a passenger asleep upon a sinking tire ship. I let my connection slide into the open dark, erasing the momentum of a very fragile spark. But you walked in and set the rubber block upon the pine, running the white cord into a dedicated line. The weight keeps the metal tip right where it needs to stay, a masterful defense against the fading of the day. The wire pulls back, but the silicone remains in place. You offer an alignment in an unpredictable space, holding the wire, keeping the connection in the light. You don't let my energy just vanish in the dust. You anchor the perimeter and build a steady trust. I don't have to reach into the shadows anymore. You leave the vital tether right above the wooden floor, holding the wire, keeping the connection in the light. You don't let my energy just vanish in the dust. You anchor the perimeter and build a steady trust. I don't have to reach into the shadows anymore. You leave the vital tether right above the wooden floor. people tape the ends and ruin all the wood and grain. A sticky sort of bandage washing out inside the rain. But you prefer a gravity that does not leave a mark, a reliable companion standing firm inside the dark. The cord is always waiting when I need to find a charge, making this intimidating room feel not so large. I push the silver metal in the socket of the phone, grateful for the feeling that I do not sit alone. Drop the nylon line, watch the rubber hole, keep the voltage close, brave and very bold. The floor remains empty and the table holds the power. I rest inside your shelter at the closing of the hour. I realize that loving is a very subtle way, a willingness to rectify a complicated fate. You didn't ask to rearrange the furniture I own. You added a foundation to the only life I've known. I traced the little channel where the white connection sits, a tactile little harbor where the broken puzzles fits. The screen lights up and shows the battery is running green, the most refreshing artifact my tired eyes have seen. I pull the cable loose and leave the rubber on the wood, accepting the reality of where we always stood. Holding the wire, keeping the connection in the light. A steady intervention for the middle of the night. You don't let my energy just vanish in the dust. You offer a foundation, an undeniable trust. The line is right there waiting, and the panic fades away. I trust your sturdy anchor as I navigate the day. The cord is caught, the desk is clear. I am home. A tall and slender metal pole reaching for the ceiling, a fragile exhibition of a complicated. I stood behind the microphone to sing a nervous track, but the tripod legs were flimsy and the structured back. The silver neck was swaying from the breathing in my chest, a terrifying wobble putting courage to the test. I used to let the music stall and grab the fallen stand, the miserable juggle and act I couldn't understand. I sacrificed the melody to keep the framing straight, a frustrating endeavor dealing with an awkward fate. But you walked in and screwed a cast iron plate into the bass, a 10-pound ring of metal modifying all the space. The pole locked in and stood erect without a single sway, a resolute defender pushing all the fear away. The weight is resting flush against the fabric of the floor. I do not have to wrestle with the balance anymore. Ground in the stand, holding the ambition in a line, a dark and heavy anchor making the performance mine. You don't restrict the height or drag the silver metal down, you simply give me balance in a dizzy rushing town. I lean into the microphone and let the vocals fly. You carry the foundation underneath the studio sky. Yeah. In a line, a dark and heavy anchor making the performance mine. You don't restrict the height or drag the silver metal down, you simply give me balance in a dizzy rushing town. I lean into the microphone and let the vocals fly. You carry the foundation underneath the studio sky. People build their stages on a temporary prop and wonder why the singing always has an early stop. But making music demands a reliable support, the designated harbor, and unshakable port. The iron plate is scratched a bit from sliding in the room, a visual translation of eradicating gloom. I wrap my hands around the pole and shut my weary eyes, trusting in the metal bass and all that it implies. Singing to the mesh, feel the iron hold, leave the wobble out brave and very bold. I trust the heavy circle and the love I know is pure. I realize that loving is a solid piece of steel, willingness to stabilize the dizzy things I feel. You didn't ask to take the mic or stand into the light. You took the lowest position to make the framing right. I hit the highest octave and the silver doesn't move. A masterclass in resting in a dedicated groove. The tracking is completed and the engineer is done. I step away from singing and I wait upon the sun. I look down at the iron resting steady on the rug, grateful for the gravity of your unyielding hug. Ground in the stand, holding the ambition in a line. A dark and heavy anchor making the performer nowhere to hide. Strip the hide or drag a silver medal down. You stabilize the panic in an unpredictable town. The stand is standing vertical and all the shaking hands. I trust your quiet bass to be the truest of my friends. The truest of my friends. Yeah. The bass is firm, the song is clear. I am safe. I bought a fresh bulb with the clear in the designated home. I reached up to the socket and I pressed the metal base, expecting an alignment in an ordinary place. I twisted the glass, hoping for the satisfying catch, just steady in an undeniable match. But turning on the metal met a frictionless return, a terrible evasion of the energy I yearned. The threading in the socket was erased and worn to dust, a physical reflection of an overriding trust. The bulb slipped from the center and it tumbled to my chest, a stark and sudden ending to an unrelenting test. The grooves are ground to nothing in the center of the ring. I cannot make a contact to illuminate a thing. Slipping the thread, rotating in an empty quiet void. I try to twist the glass but the metal drops away, leaving me standing in a dim and fading day. You cannot hold a fire when the interface is gone. I stare at the destruction and I cannot carry on. Rotating in an empty quiet void. I try to twist the glass but the metal drops away, leaving me standing in a dim and fading day. You cannot hold a fire when the interface is gone. I stare at the destruction and I cannot carry on. I try to push an angle just to wedge the glass inside, to manufacture leverage where the tired shadows hide. But wedging broken pieces is a temporary lie, a hazardous illusion underneath an open sky. We force the conversation past the tolerance of grace, demanding an attachment in the decimated space. The fixture is a hollow and recuperative shell, a quiet little feature in an isolated hell. Turn the fragile glass, feel the metal slide, feel to find the grip, nowhere left to hide. The current is denied and the room is turning back. I do not have the friction to continue on the track. I realize that forcing a connection to a line is volunteering entrance to a terrible design. Love requires an architecture willing to connect, not a smooth and ruined circle born of a neglect. We ground the vital ridges by demanding it to bend, and ruin the capacity to act as a true friend. I lower down the bulb and set it gently on the wood, accepting the finale of exactly where we stood. I walk into the hallway and I turn the power down, a cold and tired resident of this abandoned town. Slipping the thread, rotating in an empty quiet void. Let it drop, just the glass but the metal slipped away. I surrender the illusion to the closing of the day. You cannot hold a fire when the interface is gone. I leave the broken fixture and I quietly move on. Slab of yellow plastic resting on the driver's seat, a tool to clear the freezing in the devastating sleet. The windshield was an ocean of impenetrable white. I grabbed the rigid handle with a heavy gloved hand to navigate a vision I could barely understand. I pushed the angled plastic right across the frozen pane, expecting to eliminate the terrifying rain. But hiding on the edge was a jagged little chip, a missing piece of plastic on a sinking heavy ship. It cleared a tiny fraction, but it left a streak of ice, a cruel and unrelenting and an unforgiving price. I dragged it back and forth, but the vision wouldn't clear, a streaky illustration of a solitary fear. The obstacle is smeared across the surface of the view. I cannot see the highway or the memory of you. Scraping the frost, dragging on a broken line. I try to push the ice, but the instrument is flawed, leaving an obstruction that my tired eyes ignore. You cannot find a clearing when the scraper falls apart. I stare at the distortion of a disconnected heart. Scraping the frost, dragging on a broken line. I try to push the ice, but the instrument is flawed, leaving an obstruction that my tired eyes ignore. You cannot find a future when the scraper falls apart. I stare at the distortion of a disconnected heart. I try to turn the angle to employ a different side, to orchestrate a rescue where the freezing shadows hide. But broken tools will compromise the handing of the glass. They mandate that the clarity will never come to pass. We force the conversation, trying desperately to clean the ugliest perimeter my tired eyes had seen. The window is a just of a smeared and icy gray, a visual surrendered in the middle of the day. Push the yellow blade, watch the freezing streak, fell to clear the view, watch the ending peak. The effort makes a pattern of unreadable design. I'm stepping back away from your history and mine. I realize that forcing an exhausted broken blade is living in the wreckage of the errors we have made. Love requires an edge that is capable and straight, not a jagged piece of plastic modifying up the fate. We ruin the foundation by demanding it to scrape, and trap ourselves entirely with no plan of escape. I drop the broken scraper in the snow beside the tire, accepting the finale of the suffocated fire. Turn the engine off and I walk into the chill. I do not need to fight against the winter's heavy will. Scraping the frost, dragging on a ruined broken line. Let it dry. I try to push the ice, but the instrument was dead. I surrender the illusion and I clear my tired head. You cannot find it clearer when the scraper falls apart. I walk into the avenue and save my weary heart. The glass is ice, the view is lost, I am done. Mine was just a fire fading in an awkward haze, leaving a bad taste at the closing of the days. But you picked up the metal wand and pushed the cotton down, submerging the bright orange in the liquid melting brown. The flame went out in silence without any rising gray, a seamless transition at the ending of the day. You pulled the cotton back and left it coated in the wax, repairing all the patience that my tired spirit lacks. The wick is primed and ready for the morning to arrive. You soothe the burning panic and you keep the core alive. Dip in the flame, taking all the bitter smoke away. You do not blow a hurricane to extinguish what I feel. You guide the tired embers to a place where they can heal. I do not have to choke upon the ashes in the room. You bend the glowing cotton and eradicate the gloom. Dip in the flame, taking all the bitter smoke away. You do not blow a hurricane to extinguish what I feel. You guide the tired embers to a place where they can heal. I do not have to choke upon the ashes in the room. You bend the glowing cotton and eradicate the gloom. People try to end the fight with a sudden angry shout, inviting all the shadows in an overwhelming doubt. But true devotion manages the closing of the light. The brass is warm to touch and sits beside the glass, a designated sentinel watching the evening pass. I watch the liquid harden in a smooth and level plane, protected from the sorrow and the memory of pain. Push the cotton down, let the fire sleep. Avoid the bitter smoke, a promise we can keep. The air is clean and breathable inside the quiet space. I trust the simple metal in this ordinary place. I realize that loving is a very careful end, a willingness to operate as a devoted friend. You didn't ask to crush the wick or throw the jar away. You orchestrated comfort for the closing of the play. I trace the golden handle and I let my shoulders drop, grateful for the boundary where my anxious habits stop. The room smells like vanilla and the darkness is secure, a masterpiece of navigating something real and pure. I lean against the sofa and I close my tired eyes, accepting the protection underneath the velvet skies. Dip in the flame, taking all the bitter smoke away. Saving soft intervention at the closing of the day. You do not blow a hurricane to extinguish what I feel. You guide my tired edges to a place where they can heal. The air remains unblemished and the panic fades to white. I trust your quiet guidance as I rest into the night. The flame is out, the air is clean, I am home.
Massive clay container sitting on the living room floor, a heavy piece of baggage I was carrying before. I wanted to display it on the polished wooden stand, a fragile piece of furniture in this domestic land. The ceramic bottom held a rough and jagged ring of stone, a dangerous addition in a space I call my own. I hesitated placing it upon the shiny pine, afraid to ruin the surface of your history and mine. I knew my heavy burden carried scratches on the base, but you brought out a sheet of dark and woven woolen felt, a remedy to ensure the anxiety would melt. You cut out tiny circles and attached them to the clay, taking all the friction and the lumen thread away. The fabric absorbs the grit and cushions all the way. You don't admit I throw my heavy history in the trash. You insulate the edges from a devastating crash. I do not have to tiptoe with the baggage that I bring. You put a quiet buffer on an intimidating thing. You don't admit I throw my heavy history in the trash. You insulate the edges from a devastating crash. I do not have to tiptoe with the baggage that I bring. You put a quiet buffer on an intimidating thing. try to hide the heavy burdens out of sight, the desperate maneuver in the middle of the night. But pushing down a memory only amplifies the strain to let me keep the artifact and place it on display. Acknowledging the pieces of my ordinary day, the vase glides across the table without leaving any mark. A masterpiece of comfort in the center of the dark. Peel the paper back, stick the fabric down. Hold the heavy clay in this quiet town. The table is unblemished, the burden is secure. I trust the simple fabric and an empathy so pure. I realize that loving is a preventative art, a willingness to mediate the corners of the heart. You didn't ask to sand the rough and jagged edges down, you offered a protection for the center of the crown. I shift the heavy vase to catch the morning window light, protected from the panic of a complicated fight. The furniture is safe and the ceramic stand so tall, a testament to navigating the hazards of the fall. I run my hand across the glaze and offer up a smile. I know the steady comfort is going to last a while. Something made, I throw my heavy history in the trash. Nowhere to hide, you buffered the perimeter and mitigate the crash. The table stays immaculate and the baggage is embraced. I trust your quiet logic in this designated space. Holds, the wood is safe, I am home.
A yellow block of foam attached upon a silver pole, a tool we used to navigate the cleaning of the soul. We used to soak the material inside the kitchen sink to mop up all the messes and the messy thoughts. I think the sponge was soft, incapable of washing out the stain, a reliable defender in the middle of the rain. But rubber needs a constant hydration to survive, a daily sort of maintenance to keep the thing alive. We left the mop abandoned in the corner of the hall, ignoring the dry weather and the coming of the fall. The yellow foam contracted into a stiff and brittle rock, a tactile translation of a devastating shock. I tried to wipe the hardwood, but the instrument is dead, a rigid piece of plastic dragging on the words we said. The friction scrapes the varnish and it damages the floor. I cannot use the instrument to clean things anymore. I tried to wipe the sorrow, but the water blew away, leaving the dry hazard in the middle of the day. You cannot clean the future when the material turns to stone. I stare at the destruction while I navigate alone. The rigid sponge scraping on the fragile wooden board. I try to wipe the sorrow, but the water blew away, leaving a dry hazard in the middle of the day. You cannot clean a future when the material turns to stone. I stare at the destruction while I navigate alone. Just to rehydrate the core, to orchestrate a rescue on an isolated floor. But soaked and petrified rubber takes a very patient hand, a quiet dedication we refuse to understand. We starved our own affection and we let the patience dry, a voluntary prison underneath an open sky. The mop is just a paperweight, an uncooperative ghost, the cruel and heavy mockery of what I needed most. Drag the heavy rock, hear the awful scrape, fail to wash the wood, no sudden escape. The moisture is depleted and the connection is a lie. I'm standing in the wreckage underneath the open sky. I realize the force in the depleted rigid mass is volunteering entrance for the tragedies to pass. Love requires discipline to handle every spill, not a petrified emotion with a harsh and rigid will. We ruin the foundation by ignoring the routine and shatter the perimeter of a quiet, pristine scene. I drop the silver handle in the garbage by the gate, accepting the arrival of an unrewarding fate. I do not need to fight a floor that I can never clean. I walk into the avenue and wash my spirit clean. The rigid sponge scraping on a fragile wooden board. Let it drop, try to wipe the sorrow, but the material is dead. I surrender the illusion and I clear my tired head. You cannot clean a future when the texture turns to stone. I leave the broken instrument and navigate alone. The sponge is hard, the floor is scratched. I am done. A grid of gray fiberglass pulled across the windowsill, a necessary filter for the summer evening chill. We rolled the glass open to invite the summer breeze, trusting in the screen to block the pests out of the trees. The mesh allowed the air to circulate inside the dark, protecting the interior and every vital spark. But pressure from the outside caused a snag along the wire, a sort of tearing that fueled a toxic fire. A jagged hole open near the bottom of the frame, a permanent defeat of our uncooperated game. The biting insects navigated through the broken thread, invading all the sanctuary of the words we said. I try to sleep in peace, but the intrusion leaves a mark, a stinging realization in the center of the dark. The barrier is compromised and has us wandering. I'm staring at the era where the tragedies begin. The border fails the open mesh, letting in the poison and the bite. A devastating failure in the middle of the night. I try to pull the window shut, the atmosphere is stale, leaving me a victim of a complicated tale. You cannot rest in safety when the filter is destroyed. I stare at the destruction in an isolated void. I try to pull the window shut, the atmosphere is stale, leaving me a victim of a complicated tale. You cannot rest in safety when the filter is destroyed. I stare at the destruction in an isolated void. I try to cross the fibers and apply a strip of tape to orchestrate a frantic and a temporary escape. But tape and broken fiberglass, an ugly scar, a visual anatomy of exactly who we are. We let the small resentments tear the fabric of the trust, and watch the vital boundary turn into a quiet dust. The screen is flapping loosely in the blowing of the wind, a cruel and heavy memory of where we both have sinned. Feel the insect bite, watch the fabric tear, fail to block the thread in the open air. The perimeter is ruined and the safety is a lie. I am walking from the remnants underneath the open sky. I realize that forcing an exhausted broken shield is volunteering entrance to an unforgiving field. Love requires a boundary that filters out the hate, not a gaping crater that invites a bitter fate. We broke the vital instrument by asking for too much and ruined the capacity of any gentle touch. I slide the heavy window pane and lock the metal latch, accepting the finale of an unrewarded match. I take the ruined screen frame and I drop it in the hall. I walk into the avenue, abandoning it all. The open mesh, letting in the poison in the bite. Let it drop, but aid and failure in the middle of the night. Time to shine right upon it, but the barrier was dead. I surrender the illusion and I clear my tired head. You can't rest in safety when the filter is destroyed. I walk into the morning and I navigate the void. The screen is torn, the window shuts, I am done. A heavy novel resting on the table in the park, 1,000 different pages pulling me into the dark. The binding is a stubborn and the open up of you. I tried to hold the chapters with my single weary hand, a frustrating endeavor I could hardly understand. The paper folded over and erase the written line. A constant interruption of your history and mine. My thumb began to cramp from pressing firmly on the seam. A physical barrier to an ordinary dream. But you brought out a circle made of clear and polished glass. A quiet intervention, letting all the hours pass. You slipped it on my thumb and pressed the acrylic to the spine. A transparent anchor drawing out a steady line. The pages all held open, but the letters are still clear. A brilliant execution that eliminates the fear. Keeping the page, holding down the story in the light. You do not block the paragraphs or push the words away. You offer an invisible and steady place to stay. I do not have to wrestle with the closing of the book. You anchor my attention and you clarify the look. Keeping the page, holding down the story in the light. You do not block the paragraphs or push the words away. Yeah, you offer an invisible and steady place to stay. I do not have to wrestle with the closing of the book. You anchor my attention and you clarify the look. People try to read by laying heavy objects down, obscuring all the sentences and generating frown. But true support is finding ways to highlight what is there. A willingness to navigate the heavy open air. The plastic ring is light and molds perfectly to my skin. The easiest direction where the better days begin. I read the longest chapter without shifting my own grip. A masterful navigation on a very steady ship. Slide the plastic ring, push the pages flat. Read the honest text, leave the world at that. The book remains wide open and the narrative's free. I trust the simple instrument you dedicated to me. I realize that loving is a transparent embrace, a willingness to stabilize a very fragile space. You didn't ask to read the words or tear the story out. You gave me the equipment to alleviate the doubt. I finish up the paragraph and take the plastic off, protected from the panic and the solitary scarf. The afternoon is quiet and the reading is complete. A masterpiece of comfort on a very busy street. I slide the clear ring in the pocket of my coat and trust the quiet anchor of this dedicated boat. Keeping the page, holding down the story in the light. You do not block the paragraphs or push the words away. You offer an invisible and steady place to stay. The narrative is open and the frustration fades away. I trust your quiet guidance as I wake to face the day. The book is open, the thumb is free. I am reading. Rubber on the sill. I used to stub my toe against the solid piece of pine. I stumbled through the doorway, spilling water on the floor. A miserable casualty I couldn't just ignore. I walked around the perimeter to mitigate the trip. A terrifying
start consuming the momentum of my solitary spark. But you walked in carrying a wedge of heavy black and placed it on the floorboards of the solitary track. You slid the angled rubber right against the sudden rise, a beautiful transition underneath my tired eyes. The brutal interruption turns into a quiet glide, a step into the gap. You don't erase the door or try to level out the floor. You build a quiet slope so I don't stumble anymore. I don't have to hesitate or look down at my feet. You turn a hostile hurdle to a comfortable street, bridging the gap, taking out the sudden jagged hit. You don't erase the door or try to level out the floor. You build a quiet slope so I don't stumble anymore. I don't have to hesitate or look down at my feet. You turn a hostile hurdle to a comfortable street. People try to take the doors right off the heavy hinge, a cowardly avoidance of the conversational fringe. But you prefer to leave the boundaries standing on the ground and offer a transition where the safety can be found. The rubber absorbs all the friction of the running shoe, a tactile illustration of my gratitude to you. I'd glide across the threshold without breaking up my pace, a masterpiece of comfort in an ordinary place. Push the rubber down, stop the sudden trip, walk into the night on a steady ship. The jarring hit is vanished in the sloping of the bass. I am navigating clearly in a complicated space. I realize that loving is an angled piece of grace, a willingness to rectify a hazardous dark space. You didn't change my clumsy walk or criticize my stride. You modified the entrance to the places where I hide. I slide across the rubber without breaking up my flow, the most relieving journey that my tired feet can know. I turn around and look at the addition on the ground, the quietest expression of affection I have found. I step into the kitchen and I never look behind, trusting in the architecture of your quiet mind. Bridging the gap, taking out a sudden jagged hit, safe inside, taking I know where to hide. You don't erase the door or try to level out the floor. You build a quiet slope so I don't stumble anymore. The transition is a haven and the stumbling is done. I walk across your anchor and I step into the sun. The step is smooth, the walk is easy, I am home.
A tiny speck of silver mounted on a slender arm. We played the heavy records every evening in the fall, letting all the melodies echo off the plaster wall. The tip was sharp and targeted, writing in the groove. But diamond takes a beating from the miles of heavy track, a microscopic wearing that you never gather back. the sharp precision dulled into a flat and heavy stone. I dropped the silver arm to hear the music start to play, expecting a familiar and a comforting display, but a terrifying and grinding speaker, a violence that made my weary spirit so much weaker. The diamond lost its angle and is carving out the shell, transforming a sanctuary to a solitary hell. The faded inkwell scraping on the quiet plastic floor. We played the same rotation till the instrument was dead. I try to hear the chorus, but the audio's pain. I am standing in the wreckage of a solitary rain. The faded inkwell scraping on the quiet plastic floor. We played the same rotation till the instrument was dead. I try to hear the chorus, but the audio's pain. I am standing in the wreckage of a solitary rain. I tried to add some pressure to the center of the weight, to force a recognition of our complicated fate. But pushing down a blunted tip destroys the vinyl ridge, a catastrophic burning of a solitary bridge. We tried to force the dialogue when empathy was lost, refusing to acknowledge the devastating cost. The music isn't playing, it is dying in the dust, a tragic execution of an isolated trust. Scrape the heavy plastic, hear the awful sound, ruin all the history we built upon the ground. The instrument is weaponized and tearing up the art. I am walking from the wreckage of a solitary heart. I realize that forcing a connection that is dull is begging for a tragedy to break the vessel full. You cannot pull a melody from an exhausted tip. You have to find the courage to loosen up the grip. We played the music heavily and ruined the machine, a violent conclusion to the purest thing I've seen. I lift the silver arm and shut the motor down, embracing the silence in the center of the town. I take the ruined record and I drop it in the trash, accepting that the history has turned to silent ash. The faded inkwell scraping on the quiet plastic floor. Turn it off! Tragic realization we aren't singing anymore. Make it stop. Played the same rotation till the instrument was dead. I silence the machinery and clear my heavy head. I cannot pull a melody from an exhausted tip. I step out of the living room and sink the heavy ship. The deck is quiet, the vinyl is scarred. I am leaving.
Hover on the rack, wrapping round a rubber cord, tool designed to hold the heavy boxes by the door. We stretched it around the luggage on the metal of the rack, a physical assurance we were getting safely back. The hooks were fastened tightly and the tension felt so strong, a quiet guarantee that we were doing nothing wrong. But rubber is a memory that fades when pulled too far, a terrifying lesson for exactly who we are. We left it stretched and heavy in the middle of the sun, ignoring the reality of what we had begun. I unhooked the metal end to take the luggage down, expecting a retrieval in the center of the town, but the cord remained elongated a saggy, lifeless string, a devastating ending for a flexible, warm thing. The elasticity is gone, the fabric hangs so loose, a miserable consequence of solitary abuse. Snapped elastic hanging loose upon the metal bar, a tragic little symptom of exactly who we are. I try to wrap the luggage, but the rubber doesn't bite, leaving a disjointed mess in the middle of the night. You cannot secure a future when the tension is destroyed. I stare at the destruction in an isolated void. Snapped elastic hanging loose upon the metal bar, a tragic little symptom of exactly who we are. I try to wrap the luggage, but the rubber doesn't bite, leaving a disjointed mess in the middle of the night. You cannot secure a future when the tension is destroyed. I stare at the destruction in an isolated void. I try to tie a manual knot, to force the nylon tight, to orchestrate a rescue in the middle of the night. But tying broken rubber leaves a clumsy, ugly bump, a miserable failure resting on a broken stump. We force the conversation past the tolerance of the frame, demanding a perfection in an isolated game. The bungee cord is flapping in the blowing of the wind, a cruel and heavy memory of where we both have sinned. Pull the heavy cord, feel the hollow slack, fail to find the grip on a ruined track. The angle is corrupted and the symmetry is gone. I do not have the friction to continue holding on. I realize that forcing a connection past the line is volunteering to destroy the original design. Love requires a mutual and delicate response, not a heavy stretching in an isolated trance. We ruined the foundation by demanding it to yield, and shattered the perimeter of a solitary field. I pull the useless nylon and I drop it in the trash, accepting that the history has turned a silent ash. I leave the heavy luggage resting idle on the ground. I walk away from fighting for the answers never found. Snapped elastic hanging loose upon the metal bar, a tragic little symptom of exactly who we are. I try to wrap the luggage, but the rubber had to fail. I surrender the illusion of a complicated tale. You cannot secure a future when the tension is destroyed. I walk into the avenue and navigate the void. The cord is loose, the grip is lost, I am done.
A tall ceramic planter resting on the patio floor. I filled it up with soil in a very heavy green, the most ambitious garden that my tired eyes had seen. But the base was slightly curved and the ceramic wouldn't sit, a dangerous foundation for the things I try to knit. I used to watch the pottery shake whenever I walked past, the terrifying gamble that was never meant to last. The wind would blow the branches and the center started lean, a miserable symptom of a complicated scene. But you brought out a drop, I made a solid vintage brass, and placed it on the concrete in the middle of the grass. You lifted up the planter and you set it in the ring, a stabilizing anchor that changed every single thing. The metal grabs the ceramic and it locks the center tight, a physical translation of the night. Grounding the sway, stopping all the rattling in the dark. A quiet intervention for a terrified weak spark. You do not build a brand new pot or throw the green away. You slide a heavy anchor and you make the timber stay. I do not have to panic when the floor begins to move. You give my heavy history a designated groove. Grounding the sway, stopping all the rattling in the dark. A quiet in the dark, a quiet intervention for a terrified weak spark. You do not build a brand new pot or throw the green away. You slide a heavy anchor and you make the timber stay. I don't have to panic when the floor begins to move. You give my heavy history a designated groove. People try to force the clay to bend against its will, a miserable tactic ending in an ugly spill. But you respect the gravity and work around the slope, a masterclass in navigating complicated hope. The brass doesn't slip or leave a scratch upon the wood. It stays invisible and does exactly what it should. I press my hand against the side and push it with my weight, a test of the resilience of my newly altered fate. Slide the metal and watch the ceramic stray. Stop the sudden shake, hold the heavy weight. The plan is standing tall and the anxiety is dead. I trust the quiet safety of the honest words reset. I realize that loving is a geometric grace, a willingness to rectify a terrifying space. You didn't ask to empty out the volumes of my past. You leveled the foundation so the memories could last. The leaves remain in order and the pottery is secure, a testament to what devotion absolute and pure. I trace the black brass peeking out beneath the vase, appreciating the design inside this quiet place. I step away and view the room without a single doubt, grateful for the balance that we finally figured out. Grounding this way, stopping all the rattling in the dark. Safe inside, a quiet intervention for a terrified weak spark. Nowhere to hide, do not build a brand new pot or throw the green away. Yeah, you find the hidden gap and make the heavy timber stay. The floor is still uneven, but the structure is aligned. I rest within the haven of your dedicated mind.
A block of carved aluminum hanging on the nylon core, a mechanism waiting to provide a little more. I climbed the vertical ascent upon the rugged stone. I tried to walk alone, my fingers were exhausted from the tension of the grip. A miserable captain on a sinking heavy ship. The chalk washed off my knuckles in the middle of the rain. A fast and furious addition to the rising pain. I reached up for a narrow ledge and felt my fingers slide, a terrifying failure with no avenue to hide. My body started falling toward the bottom of the deep, a horrifying realization making my soul weep. But you attached a silver cam upon the safety cord, a quiet intervention I had previously ignored. The metal teeth snap forward and they bite into the line, stopping the momentum of this tired heart of mine. Catching the plunge, grabbing the nylon in the dark, a dedicated savior for an isolated spark. You do not let my arrogant mistakes define the end. You snap into position like a designated friend. I don't have to hit the bottom of the rocky floor. You absorb the gravity and walk me to the door. Catching the plunge, grabbing the nylon in the dark. Catching the plunge, catching the plunge, grabbing the nylon in the dark, a dedicated savior for an isolated spark. You do not let my arrogant mistakes define the end. You snap into position like a designated friend. I don't have to hit the bottom of the rocky floor. walk me to the door. People try to climb a mountain lacking any gear, depending on an ego to eradicate the fear. But gravity is ruthless and it never compromises. A harsh and sudden teacher underneath the open skies. You trust the simple physics of a calibrated tool, a quiet intervention for a dedicated fool. The device takes all the pressure and the nylon doesn't rip, a masterful deflection of a devastating slip. Feel the sudden drop, hear the metal bite, stop the rapid fall in the fading light. The mountain is a monster, but the anchor is secure. I trust the simple mechanism that is absolute and pure. I realize that loving is a safety in the air, a willingness to intercept and isolate and care. You didn't ask to pull me up or carry all my weight. You offered an assurance to manipulate my fate. I hang suspended in the harness, catching my own breath, a millimeter distance from a terrifying death. I look up at the silver block and offer up a smile, knowing that the climbing is going to take a while. I grab the rope above the cam and pull my body near, grateful for the barrier you manufactured here. Catching the plunge, grabbing the nylon in the dark, safe inside. Dedicated savior for an isolated spot. Nowhere to hide, do not let my arrogant mistakes define the end. And you snap into position like a designated friend. The free fall is arrested and the panic fades away. I trust your quiet anchor as I wake to face the day. The cam holds, the rope is tight, I am safe.
Yeah. A cylinder of white, resting on the bedside stand. The quiet little beacon in the dark and heavy land. We lit the cotton center when the evening started cold. The fascinating narrative we desperately told. The flame was burning bright, melting down the solid white. But we left the candle burning in an isolated room, ignoring the perimeter of undeniable doom. The wax became a liquid pool expanding to the edge, a terrifying hazard on a solitary ledge. We didn't blow the fire out or navigate the drain, the sloppy execution of a solitary pain. The fire suffocated on the fuel it had produced, a tragic illustration of a quiet slow abuse. The liquid hardened over and consumed the breathing air. The wick is buried deeply in a dark and cold despair. Dead on the wick, sinking in a pool of heavy white, a silent execution in the middle of the night. We manufacture so much heat it ruined the supply, and leave the broken candle and I whisper my goodbye. You cannot burn a future when you smother the intent. I stare at all the energy we carelessly have spent. Dead on the wick, sinking in a pool of heavy white, a silent execution in the middle of the night. We manufacture so much heat it ruined the supply, and leave the broken candle and I whisper my goodbye. You cannot burn a future when you smother the intent. I stare at all the energy we carelessly have spent. From the center of the wax to orchestrate a rescue on the devastating tracks. But digging frozen paraffin destroys the fragile core. It guarantees the fire isn't burning anymore. We overwhelm the boundary with too much sudden heat, a claustrophobic perfection bringing ultimate defeat. The wick is buried permanently, hidden from the sky, a monument to forcing a connection just to die. Strike the wooden match, touch the frozen base, fail to find the spark in this empty space. We flooded out the oxygen by holding on too tight. I am sitting in the shadows of an isolated night. I realize that loving requires breathing room to grow. You have to let the liquid drain and manage what you know. If you trap the very element that gives the fire life, you suffocate the passion with an accidental knife. We poured too much affection in a very narrow space, and drowned the only light we had inside this quiet blaze. I take the Roman candle and I drop it in the trash, accepting that the history is turned to silent ash. I do not try to strike a match to resurrect the ghost. I walk away from the illusion that is hurting me the most. Dead on the wick, sinking in the pool of heavy walk into the avenue and leave the time we spent. The wick is buried, the flame is dead, I am gone. A silver ring of teeth attached to the pedal crane. We rode the heavy frame up a terrifying hill. The chain was wrapped securely in the center of the ring, transferring all the motion to a complicated thing. But gradients are ruthless when the energy is weak, a physical demand upon the promises we speak. I tried to shift the lever to an easier line, to orchestrate a rescue of your history and mine. But shifting under pressure makes the metal jump the track, a fatal error, leaving me with no way to go back. The chain slipped off the sprocket and it tumbled to the frame, a sudden termination of a complicated game. The pedals rotate freely in an empty, quiet void. The forward motion stalls and the connection is destroyed. Shifting out of gear, spinning in a dizzy empty space. I push the heavy rubber but the metal doesn't bite, leaving an obstruction in the middle of the night. You cannot ride a future when the intersection dies. I stare at the destruction underneath the open skies. Shifting out of gear, spinning in a dizzy empty space. I push the heavy rubber but the metal doesn't bite, leaving an obstruction in the middle of the night. You cannot ride a future when the intersection dies. I stare at the destruction underneath the open skies. I tried to push the metal back upon the silver tooth, to artificially construct an isolated truth, but grease and dirt combined to make a slippery defense. A miserable tactic overriding common sense. We forced the conversation past the tolerance of grace, demanding an attachment in a decimated space. The chain is hanging loose and dragging heavily behind, a visual reflection of an isolated mind. Push the silver crank, feel the hollow spin, accept the quiet end. Where the tears begin, the angle is corrupted and the symmetry is gone. I do not have the friction to continue holding on. I realize that forcing a connection past the line is volunteering to destroy the original design. Love requires a mutual and delicate trance. We ruin the foundation by demanding it to yield, and shatter the perimeter of a solitary field. I step off of the pedals and I drop it on the floor, accepting I will never turn the handle anymore. The bike is sitting awkwardly unfixable and sad. I walk away from fighting for the history we had. Shifting out the gears, spinning in the dizzy empty space. Let it go, I try to push the rubber but the intersection failed. I surrender the illusion to the sorrow that prevailed. You cannot ride a future when the intersection dies. I drop the broken instrument and leave the broken trust. The chain